I knew something was off the moment I saw the fresh tire tracks in the gravel. It was early Saturday morning, and I was planning to clean out the old hay bales in my barn outside town. I moved out here 2 years ago to get away from the suffocating grip of city HOAs. I thought I succeeded until the HOA from the neighboring subdivision decided I hadn't. My name's Kellan Ashford. I own 10 acres just outside the boundary of Sycamore Glade, a pretentious little development that thinks it owns the whole zip code. I'm not part of their HOA. Never signed anything, never agreed to it, but that hasn't stopped them from trying to bully me into compliance. And no one embodies that nonsense more than Beverly Olston, the HOA vice president and full-time tyrant with a blonde bob and a permanent scowl. 2 weeks ago, Beverly knocked on my door holding an HOA newsletter and a clipboard like she was serving a warrant. "You need to repaint your barn," she said without a hello. "It's visible from the southern walking trail. It violates our color harmony standards." I leaned on the doorframe. "I'm not in your neighborhood. It's within the visual perimeter," she sniffed. "That makes it our concern." I shut the door mid-sentence. Now, standing in front of my barn, I saw a silver Lexus SUV parked inside. My barn doors were wide open, like someone owned the place. I walked over, heart rate already climbing. That car wasn't there yesterday. I stepped inside. Sure enough, there she was, Beverly, sitting in the driver's seat, scrolling on her phone like it was her personal garage. I rapped on the window. She looked up, rolled it down, and said, "Oh. I just needed a shaded place to park while we do the HOA trail cleanup. It's not a big deal." "You're on my property," I said flatly. "Oh, don't be dramatic," she waved me off. "You left the doors open." "No, I didn't," she ignored that. "Besides, I'm technically the HOA access liaison for this area. We're managing the shared boundary zones." "There's no such thing," I said, already pulling the barn doors shut behind me. I slipped the bolt into place. Her reaction was instant. "You can't do that." "Open the doors." I locked the padlock and leaned against the wooden frame. "Call the sheriff if you've got a problem." She did. 20 minutes later, a county sheriff rolled up. I stayed calm, arms crossed, while Beverly wailed from inside the barn like she was being held hostage. Deputy Harland stepped out of his cruiser, looked at me, then at the locked barn. "Morning, Kellan," he sighed. "You got a hostage in there or what?" "Nope," I said. "Just a trespasser." She let herself in. Harland walked over, knocked on the barn door, and told Beverly to unlock the car and step out. She did, flustered and fuming. "She locked me in," she shouted. "He can't do that. I'm the HOA vice president." Harland looked her up and down. "Ma'am, this isn't HOA property. This is private land. Did you have permission to be here?" He left the doors open. "That's not permission," Harland said. Beverly's face turned redder than a brick wall. "I'm filing a complaint." "You're going in the cruiser," Harland replied. "Trespassing on private property. You can explain it to the judge." And just like that, Beverly Olston, HOA tyrant of Sycamore Glade, was arrested in my driveway, and I hadn't even had my coffee yet. The following Tuesday, I was elbow deep in a busted carburetor when a certified letter arrived. The envelope had the Sycamore Glade HOA logo embossed across the top 3 pine trees and a fake little gazebo. I tossed it on my workbench and didn't open it until after lunch, figuring it was an apology or at least an attempt at damage control. I was wrong. Inside was a formal notice of encroachment, claiming my barn extended 12 feet onto what they now referred to as HOA-managed buffer land. There was even a hand-drawn map, clearly traced from an outdated survey, showing a fictitious boundary line that cut right through the middle of my hayfield. I stared at the paper for a long moment, then read it again. It was signed by none other than Beverly's husband, Keith Olston, the HOA president, so that's how they were playing it. I drove straight to the county recorder's office and requested the most recent plat maps. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with a bun and a coffee mug that said, "I file papers, not feelings," handed me a manila folder after about 20 minutes of searching. "Your property ends where it always has," she said. "No changes filed, no easements granted." "You're clean." I nodded, thanked her, and made copies. On my way out, I noticed the public notice board had a flyer pinned up. Sycamore Glade HOA was hosting a community oversight town hall that Thursday evening. Open to the public. I circled it on my calendar. When Thursday rolled around, I dug out my old contractor's briefcase. Inside were blueprints, title documents, and the original property boundaries from when I bought the land. I added the new maps from the recorder's office and stapled them all together. Then I drove over. The town hall was being held in the community clubhouse, a sterile-looking building with too much faux stone and not enough insulation. Inside, about 30 residents sat in folding chairs facing a long table where the HOA board presided like a tribunal. Keith sat in the center, Beverly next to him, arms crossed like she was bracing for a hurricane. They didn't notice me until Keith banged a gavel and called the meeting to order. "We'll begin tonight with some updates on community border management," he said, adjusting his glasses. "There's been confusion regarding the perimeter along the southern trail. We've discovered an unauthorized structure partially intruding into HOA buffer space." A few heads turned. I made my way to the front. "You mean my barn?" I said, loud enough to cut through the murmurs. Keith's jaw tightened. "You're not a member of this community, sir." "Correct, which is why your claim is garbage." I set my briefcase down on the table and opened it. "These are official records from the county. Your map is a joke. Your letter is fabricated." "You're attempting a land grab." Beverly leaned forward. "We're protecting our residents from visual and structural pollution visible from shared spaces." "I'm protecting myself from your fantasy maps," I countered. "And by the way, your little stunt last week. That's on file too." Sheriff's report and all, someone in the audience raised their hand, an older man in a golf windbreaker. "Wait, are you the guy she got arrested for sitting in his barn?" "Yep," I said, turning to face the crowd. "She parked her car inside my private barn without permission. I shut the door to keep my livestock from wandering in. She called the sheriff. He arrested her for trespassing. End of story." More murmurs. Keith tried to regain control. "This is not a forum for." I held up a document. "This is a formal petition to file a cease and desist order against the HOA for harassment, false claims, and attempted interference with private property. I've contacted a land use attorney. If this continues, I'll initiate proceedings." That caught their attention. Until now, they'd bullied retirees and young families into submission with ambiguous rules and threats of fines. But I had something they didn't expect: documentation and no fear of confrontation. A blonde woman with a toddler on her hip stood up near the back. "Wait, they told me I had to pay a fence violation fine because my dog barked at someone on the trail. They said my fence was provoking aggression." The man in the windbreaker shook his head. "They fined me for using the wrong shade of mulch. My wife cried over that one." Another woman stood up. "They cited me for having a kayak visible from the street. I live on the lake. Where else am I supposed to put it?" The room began to shift. What started as a quiet meeting was turning into a powder keg. Keith banged the gavel again. "This is not relevant to tonight's agenda." I raised my voice. "It's exactly relevant. This isn't about rules, it's about control. They're inventing authority that doesn't exist. If they're willing to falsify a property map to grab land, what else are they willing to do?" Keith stood abruptly. "This meeting is adjourned." "No," said a voice from the door. Deputy Harland stepped into the room, badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "This meeting's just getting interesting." Beverly's face went pale. Harland walked to the front and pulled a folded document from his chest pocket. "We got a call from the county assessor's office after someone tried to file a revised boundary claim without proper documentation. That someone was you, Mr. Olston." Keith's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "Filing false land documents is a crime," Harland continued. "We're opening an investigation. Until that's resolved, you're not to contact Mr. Ashford, file claims against his property, or send any correspondence from the HOA. Do I make myself clear?" Keith sat down slowly. Beverly looked like she wanted to vanish into the floor. After the meeting, 3 families approached me in the parking lot. One of them, a quiet man with grease-stained hands and a Ford cap, said, "I work concrete. You let me know if you ever need a new driveway poured. On the house." Another woman handed me a flash drive. "Security footage from my backyard. Shows Beverly walking toward your barn the morning she got arrested. Thought you might want a time-stamped copy." I took it, nodding once. Appreciated. The tide had turned. The HOA had made a mistake. They thought I was just another quiet property owner they could intimidate. They forgot some of us still know how to read legal docs, draw a hard line, and stand our ground without folding. They tried to make an example out of me. Instead, I became the reason the boardroom lost its grip. The following week brought a strange hush over Sycamore Glade. It was like someone had unplugged the loudspeaker that usually piped arrogance into the neighborhood. No newsletters, no violation slips, no clipboard patrols. For the first time in a while, nobody from the HOA showed up near my south fence line. But I knew better than to think they'd given up. On Wednesday morning, I drove into town to deliver a box of hand-forged steel brackets to a client. When I got back, something felt off. My gate, normally chained and padlocked, was closed but not secured. I climbed out of my truck and examined the latch. The lock was hanging open, still hooked through the chain but unclicked. I checked the barn. Nothing was missing, but someone had rifled through the storage bins near the back wall. My welding torch had been dragged out and left sitting on the workbench. A roll of fencing wire was unspooled across the floor like someone had yanked it in a hurry and dropped it. I checked the feed room. My ledger book, where I recorded deliveries and supply expenses, was gone. I installed 2 trail cameras that night, one pointed at the gate, the other tucked behind a hay bale inside the barn. By Friday, I had footage. At 2:30 in the morning, a pair of flashlights bobbed down my gravel drive. The video was grainy but clear enough to make out the figures. One was tall and thin, wearing a reflective vest. The other shorter, with a familiar stiff gait and a cropped haircut that didn't belong on any farmhand. Keith and Beverly. They circled the barn like raccoons, scanning the walls. Keith jimmied the padlock with a flat bar while Beverly stood lookout. Once inside, they rummaged around for nearly 20 minutes. Keith took photos of my equipment. Beverly flipped through a binder on the workbench, then snapped something out of it and pocketed it. They left the gate unlatched when they left. I knew exactly what they were doing. If they couldn't win with fake boundary lines, they'd try to invent a safety violation. Leak something to the fire marshal, claim hazardous storage, maybe even trigger a forced inspection to shut me down. They weren't just crossing a line anymore. They were playing with felonies. I burned copies of the footage and brought them straight to Deputy Harland. He watched the video twice before speaking. "They broke and entered," he said, "and they took something. That's burglary." He placed the DVD into an evidence envelope and slid it into a drawer behind his desk. Then he picked up the phone and called the county prosecutor's office. By Monday morning, arrest warrants were issued for both of them. The fallout came fast. Beverly was picked up while walking her dog along the trail behind Sycamore Glade's communal pond. Keith was arrested at his office. He worked as a claims adjuster for a mid-sized insurance firm across town. Their mugshots hit the local news that evening, tucked between a high school football update and a missing cat story. But it was enough. Residents started talking. A father of 3 posted on a local forum about how the HOA tried to fine him for excessive trampoline noise, despite his backyard being fully fenced and surrounded by hedges. A retired nurse said she was threatened with lien action for keeping a decorative windmill in her flower bed. A former board member from years ago came forward anonymously, claiming they'd resigned after noticing financial discrepancies in how annual dues were being logged. The next day, I received a letter from a woman named Dana Morrow. She lived 3 streets deep into Sycamore Glade and had been quietly tracking HOA spending for over a year. Her brother was a forensic accountant, and together, they'd compiled a spreadsheet showing thousands of dollars in maintenance fees that didn't align with any actual vendor work. Entire line items were marked as trail preservation expenses, but no one could ever recall seeing the trails maintained. Some of the invoices were issued to a now-defunct LLC registered under the name Olston Property Services. Dana asked if I'd be willing to go with her to the county auditor's office. She figured my history with the board might give the report some weight. We met the next morning and walked in together. The auditor's assistant took one look at the folder Dana handed over and called in her supervisor. Within an hour, the office had opened a formal inquiry into the HOA's financial practices. Back in Sycamore Glade, things were unraveling. An emergency meeting was called, but only 2 board members showed up, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Without Keith or Beverly, the leadership structure collapsed. Residents demanded answers. That weekend, I was approached by a man named Russell Jang, who lived at the northern edge of the development. He was a civil engineer and quietly admitted he'd always disagreed with the board's boundary reinterpretations. He handed me a rolled-up schematic. It was a comprehensive drainage and topographical survey of the area, done for a public works project 2 years ago. It showed, with exact measurements, that the buffer zone the HOA had used to justify their phantom claims didn't legally exist. It was a drainage easement owned by the county. Unauthorized construction or enforcement on it, a violation of municipal code. The report made its way to the city council. By the end of the month, the council had passed a motion to audit all registered HOAs in the county for compliance with land use laws, financial transparency, and board election procedures. Sycamore Glade was the first on the list. Meanwhile, Beverly and Keith had their first court appearance. Their attorney tried to argue that their actions were part of routine property oversight, but the judge wasn't buying it. The footage, the late-night timing, and the missing documents all pointed to premeditation. The judge set bail but imposed a no-contact order that prohibited them from communicating with me or setting foot within 100 yards of my property. I thought that would be the end of it, until I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper. It was a photocopy of my property deed, but someone had drawn a thick red X across my barn and written "unfit for use. Remove." in sloppy marker. I brought it to Harland. He didn't speak, just took the envelope, bagged it, and promised to pull prints. 2 days later, the county discovered 2 more fraudulent documents filed under the HOA's name. One attempting to register a community right-of-way across my gravel road, and another requesting a tax reassessment of my land, both unsigned. Both time-stamped the same day. Beverly was locked in my barn. The prosecutor's office amended the charges. Now they faced conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful impersonation of a public entity, and tampering with county records. Beverly's attorney tried to cut a deal. She'd resign from the HOA permanently and cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. Keith refused. He still believed he could clarify everything in a hearing. He had no idea half the community had already turned against him. By the time their trial date was set, over 40 residents had signed a petition to dissolve the current HOA board entirely. Another 20 volunteered to form an interim committee, one that would operate under strict transparency guidelines, with all budgets and enforcement actions subject to public review. Dana was named interim treasurer. I declined the offer to join the committee. I told them I'd done my part. But I did attend the first official meeting under the new leadership, just to watch. They opened with a statement acknowledging past abuses and pledged to never again let a board operate without oversight. Afterward, a woman from the committee walked over and handed me a small wooden plaque. It was made from reclaimed cedar, carved by one of the residents. It read, "Property rights defender in honor of standing the line." I didn't say much, just nodded. That night I drove home, made a fresh pot of coffee, and stood out by the barn. The stars were out, quiet, no flashlights. No phantom claims. No SUVs parked where they didn't belong. For the first time in months, the barn just looked like a barn again, and that was more than enough. I was back welding a hinge on my pasture gate when the call came in. Deputy Harlan's name flashed across my phone. I killed the torch, pulled off my gloves, and answered with a grunt. "We've got something," he said, voice lower than usual. "You might want to come down to the station." When I arrived, he was waiting in the back evidence room with a USB stick and a folder already open on the table. He didn't say much, just slid the folder toward me and hit play on the video file. The footage was from a dash cam. A county maintenance truck parked along a service lane that curved behind Sycamore Glade's retention pond. The timestamp was from 3 months ago. At first, nothing happened, just crickets and the soft hum of the truck's engine. Then, a pair of headlights flared in the distance. A dark SUV crept along the gravel shoulder and stopped behind the truck. Two figures stepped out. They walked up to the maintenance truck and crouched near the back tire. One held a clipboard. The other bent down and placed something just behind the wheel. The screen's resolution wasn't perfect, but you could see it a steel spike strip, folded and weighted at the ends. The county worker, unaware, returned a few minutes later and backed up. A loud pop followed by the hiss of air and the truck listing hard to one side. The worker got out, looked confused, then furious. Harland paused the video. We didn't realize what we were looking at until the county's internal audit flagged damage claims filed by Sycamore Glades HOA. They were reporting trail obstructions and claiming reimbursement for volunteer cleanup hours. But it turns out they staged the damage and logged emergency response time as HOA labor. I leaned back against the wall, arms folded. You're saying they sabotaged a county vehicle to bill fake hours, Harlan nodded, and that's just one incident. We cross-checked the GPS logs with their reimbursement requests. They've been gaming the system for nearly 2 years. Staging trail blockages, lighting small brush piles, then calling them in as fire hazards just to claim response coordination and inflate their hours. Most of the paperwork traces back to Keith and Beverly. A few other board members may have signed off, but those two orchestrated it. I shook my head. You got enough to make it stick, he tapped the folder. We've got more than enough. Fraud, sabotage of county equipment, falsifying municipal reports. We're talking state-level charges now. By the time I left the station, an arrest team was already en route to Keith and Beverly's temporary residence, a rental home about 20 minutes out of town. They'd sold their Sycamore Glade house the week before, probably thinking they'd outrun the fallout once the dust settled. They were wrong. News broke the next morning, not just local, regional. 2 former HOA board members indicted for fraud, tampering with emergency equipment, and obstruction of county operations. Photos of the spike strip, quotes from the county auditor, even a statement from the state's attorney general's office announcing formal charges. The community lost what little patience it had left. Within 24 hours, residents voted to dissolve the HOA completely, not re-elect. Not reform, dissolve. A group of homeowners pooled funds to hire an independent legal consultant to unwind the contracts and file the necessary dissolution paperwork. Without Keith or Beverly to block the vote, it passed unanimously. Every single household submitted a signed ballot. Some included handwritten notes asking for the HOA's records to be made public. Dana Morrow offered to help sort through the financial files. She showed up at the old clubhouse with a portable scanner, 2 labeled boxes, and a small army of volunteers. They documented everything: vendor lists, banking records, internal memos, and uploaded it to a shared drive. Nothing was hidden anymore. Turns out, Sycamore Glade had been quietly bleeding funds for years. Keith had authorized payments to shell companies for consulting work that never occurred. Beverly had submitted dozens of receipts for event coordination that matched the dates of her personal spa appointments and shopping trips. One file even contained a reimbursement request for a set of patio furniture marked as community seating, but found on a pool deck in a photo on Beverly's now deleted social media. The community took it all in stride. There was no shouting, no pitchforks, just quiet, deliberate action. They cleaned house, top to bottom. And then, something I never expected happened. A man named Curtis Reddick, who owned the parcel of land to the east of mine, one I'd never spoken to outside of a neighborly wave, showed up at my gate. He was holding a rolled-up blueprint and a thermos. "You got a minute?" he asked. I nodded, and we walked to the shade of my shed. Curtis set the blueprint on the tool bench and unrolled it. It was a detailed plan for a shared-use agricultural co-op, small gardens, a chicken run, maybe a greenhouse on the border between our land. "I've been holding on to this idea for a while," he said, "but the HOA always blocked anything that wasn't ornamental landscaping. Figured now was the time to float it." I looked the plan over. It was simple, practical, and didn't involve a single line of fine print regulations. "You thinking volunteers?" I asked. "Only folks who want in. No dues, no board, just sweat equity." We shook on it. By summer's end, the co-op was up and running. Kids from the neighborhood helped paint the garden beds. A retired mechanic fixed the irrigation timer. Somebody even donated a pair of pygmy goats. The land that once sat under the HOA's watchful eye now grew tomatoes, bell peppers, and sunflowers tall enough to block the view of anything remotely bureaucratic. As for Keith and Beverly, their court date arrived with little fanfare. They pled no contest to multiple charges, including public fraud and tampering with evidence. The judge handed down a sentence of 18 months probation, 500 hours of community service, and a permanent ban from serving on any homeowner association board in the state. They were also ordered to repay over $40,000 in restitution to Sycamore Glades former residents. I didn't attend the sentencing. I didn't need to. The barn was still standing. The gate still held. And the people who once feared clipboards and citations were now sharing potluck recipes over rows of squash and basil. One late afternoon, I walked the south fence line and spotted a freshly painted sign posted just past the old trailhead. It wasn't official, just a plank of cedar with hand-lettered paint. It read, "No trespassing, no fines, no nonsense." Below it, someone had added, "Welcome to the neighborhood." I tipped my hat and kept walking.